Welcome back. Here's the second webinar over the fall and winter seasons in the beef production cycle, as well as cow-son cow-calf management decisions and kind of a general overview. Thanks again to George for having me a part of your program. So today we'll continue on throughout the production cycle. We'll talk about fall and winter. We'll talk about some things regarding analysis of forages, marketing of your calves, preconditioning and weaning programs, winter feeding of the beef cow herd, and we'll finish up with a few cow-calf management decisions. So let's start with thinking about the fall. So I'm a big fan of the idea that it's hard to manage if you don't measure first. And so I'm a huge proponent of the idea of getting your harvested forages tested by a lab. And I'll show you a little bit now about how, once you get that lab test back, how do you interpret it? So here's an example of what that might look like from a lab in Nebraska. And so we'll kind of take each component and look at that separately. So let's start here with moisture. Okay, so we have two different components here. You can see that the middle column says as sent, and the right-hand column says dry weight. Okay, so this was a grass hay. And so in order for us to compare feeds fairly with one another, we need to compare them on a dry matter basis with all of the water dried from them. So think about how much water is in corn silage compared to how much water is in wheat straw. Okay, big difference, right? So if we wanted to balance a ration that had both of those feed components, it would be best if we could compare them on an equal basis. And so the way we do that is by dry matter. So we see here that this particular hay was 87.42% dry matter, so that means about 12.5% moisture. So like I said, to accurately compare forages of differing water content, we have to do that on a dry matter basis. Next is crude protein. As you can see here, we have now started to fill in the dry weight or dry matter column of our analysis results. And so crude protein is simply a measure of nitrogen content. So in the laboratory, we would measure the amount of nitrogen in a sample, and then we multiply that by a constant of 6.25 to yield crude protein. So we can see we have about 8% crude protein on a dry matter basis in this particular grass hay. So then we can measure the fiber in a feed, and so in this particular sample we measured the what's called acid detergent fiber, or ADF. And so ADF is a measure of the cellulose and lignin in the cell wall of a plant. And the way we do that is as the name implies, we have a soapy solution that's acidic, and it washes away all the cell solubles and one component of the cell wall called hemicellulose, and what's left behind is the cellulose and lignin. ADF is related to forage digestibility, such that as the amount of ADF in a forage increases, digestibility decreases. Okay, so hopefully this makes sense to you, as if you have more fiber in something, you have less energy from it, and so it's less digestible to the cow. Now another fiber component that we can measure is called neutral detergent fiber, and while it was not on this particular sample, it's an important component of forage analysis as well. And so in an NDF analysis, we have that same soapy solution, but instead of it being acidic, it's about pH of 7 or neutral. And so this washes away the cell solubles, but what's left behind are the hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin. So the main difference between ADF and NDF is that NDF still contains hemicellulose and ADF does not. So like ADF, NDF can help us predict animal performance, and it's related to forage intake in the same way that as NDF increases, intake decreases. Okay, so a feed that has a higher amount of fiber and as NDF, a cow isn't able to eat as much of. Now energy can be measured in a variety of ways. We've talked a little bit about TDN in this webinar series thus far, and talking about total digestible nutrients as a measure of energy. And so as the name implies, it does estimate the digestibility of the forage. And so you can see down here on the bottom, we have TDN value of about 56.5 on a dry matter basis for this particular grass hay. And so yes, the higher the TDN value, the more energy is available to the animal because the digestibility of the forage is increased. Another way that we measure energy in beef cattle production is called the net energy system. And this is an alternate way to assign energy values to feedstuffs. And so it's based on how the energy is partitioned within the cow for different uses. So for her maintenance, for example, for growth, and for lactation. And so we can see here on our little table that's cut out from our analysis, we have NEL, or net energy for lactation, maintenance, and gain, and those are measured in a unit called megacals per pound. So this just allows us a better estimate of how the energy in the forage is going to be used by the animal. So then now we need to think about how might the hay, this for example, meet the cow's requirements. Okay, so if we look at this from an energy standpoint, we're going to use a 1,400-pound cow. Now, when I ask ranchers in Montana how much do your cows weigh, every single cow in Montana apparently weighs 1,200 pounds, and I think that that is a lie, and everyone's lying to me, and that's okay. I just don't believe you, and I use 1,400-pound cows. If we look at, and useful exercise sometime is take a look at your local sale barn cull cow weights from that market report and tell me how many are 1,200-pound cows. So we're going to use a 1,400-pound cow. We're going to assume that she's going to eat about 2% of her body weight on a dry matter basis, so that would be about 28 pounds. So if we use the grass hay in our example that we've used, and we say, well, we're going to have 28 pounds of feed that she's going to eat on a dry basis, and there was 56.5% TDN on a dry matter basis in that hay, then every day that she eats 28 pounds of dry feed, we're about 16 pounds of TDN is provided by that hay. Well, how does that match up then with her TDN requirement? So in mid-gestation, she needs about 12.2 pounds per day, and in late gestation about 14.4 pounds of TDN per day. So this hay would be good for any time post-weaning on up to calving. But we can see that early lactation requirement increases pretty dramatically. So depending on how much milk she produces, so this is 17.5 to about 20 pounds of TDN per day. That'd be about 20 pounds of peak milk compared to 30 pounds of peak milk, which would be about 6 to 8 weeks. How much milk she could produce 6 to 8 weeks after calving. So if we wanted to meet the early lactation requirements, we need to either pick a different hay or provide some sort of supplement with this hay to meet those requirements. So what about protein? So we know how we did on energy. What about protein? Okay, same setup, 1,400-pound cow, 28 pounds of dry matter intake. We had about 8% crude protein, right? 7.92% crude protein on a dry matter basis in that hay. So we know that she gets about 2.22 pounds of crude protein from the hay. And like the energy in this example, this meets both the mid and late gestation requirements for crude protein. But again, during early lactation, we're short, and we would need some more protein if we wanted to meet her protein requirement. We'll talk a little bit now about nitrate toxicity concerns in harvested forages. It's of particular concern in annual forages, and nitrate favorable conditions that we can experience include drought, frost, unseasonable or prolonged cool temperatures, and the like. It's important to try to test nitrates before you cut the hay if you possibly can. Your local extension offices will have a nitrate quick test option that can help you with that. The toxicity is caused by nitrite accumulation. And so I'll tell you a little bit about how this all kind of happens. So in the plant, nitrate is a normal part of the plant's metabolism. And the plant takes up nitrate and it converts it to nitrite. And then nitrite is converted to ammonia, which is the nitrogen source for the plant to build protein from. In the cow, in the rumen, the same thing happens. Nitrate is converted to nitrite, which is then converted to ammonia, and the rumen microbes use that nitrogen to make protein. However, in the rumen, the first step from nitrate to nitrite goes really fast. And so if we have an overwhelming amount of nitrate and we get a big glut of nitrite accumulating, we can have a slowdown where nitrite just starts to sit in the rumen. Well, when that happens, it can cross the rumen wall and get into the blood. And red blood cells, when they come by, they think that nitrite looks just like oxygen. And so nitrite bonds with the hemoglobin in a red blood cell, and it turns it into a form called methemoglobin. And once methemoglobin is formed, it can't go back to hemoglobin, and methemoglobin can't carry oxygen. So nitrate toxicity, in both its chronic and acute forms, is basically oxygen deprivation in the body of the cow. So from a chronic standpoint, if we had, say, a moderate level of nitrate that an animal was consuming over an extended period of time, we could see things like reduced appetite and milk production. They might have a rough hair coat, not look like they're doing very well. They might be losing weight when we expected them to maintain, or maintaining when we'd expected them to gain. And the main chronic nitrate toxicity symptom that's one that's pretty telling is abortion. Okay, so these first 4 nitrate toxicity symptoms are kind of the same toxicity or deficiency symptoms for pretty much any nutrient in the whole wide world. Okay, so abortion's the big deal. So think about how much oxygen demand that fetus is putting on that cow as it's growing. Okay, and if so, she's had a decreased ability to carry oxygen in the blood because of this nitrite accumulation. If she sloughs that calf, she gets rid of a lot of that oxygen demand. So certainly if I have folks calling me in the wintertime to talk to me about they've had a set of cows, we have some abortions, my first question is going to be, what are you feeding them? Okay, are we talking about a barley hay or an oat hay or a wheat hay here? So on the other hand, from an acute nitrate toxicity standpoint, say we have some really hot hay and we have a group of cows busted into the stack yard overnight and just pigged out, right? So we're probably going to find them keeled over the next day. So as before you find those acute nitrate toxicity deaths, the cattle will have experienced an accelerated pulse rate and labored breathing, along with muscle tremors due to this oxygen deprivation issue, weakness and staggering gait, and then cyanosis. So when you find these cattle, you probably see signs of struggle because of these first parts. And then cyanosis would be, so their mucous membranes would be really blue, so we'd have lack of oxygen in those. So rather than the nice healthy pink color that we'd expect, we might see a lot of blue. And furthermore, if we look at the blood of these animals experiencing this, it'll be very brown, as opposed to that nice bright cherry red color that's full of oxygen. And like I said, in general, from an acute standpoint, is when we might have some death loss. So here are the NSU Extension nitrate toxicity guidelines. I will say that our guidelines are more conservative than some you'll see from other institutions, or that you might see from a testing laboratory. This is based on some career experience of our previous and current extension forage specialists, and so just let you know now that these are more conservative. So nitrate toxicity and nitrate measurements in the laboratory can cause confusion because as you can see here, they can be reported in a variety of ways. So one is nitrate nitrogen, that first column. The other is just as nitrate. And here we have them reported in parts per million. You can also have laboratories that report them as a percentage. Okay, so having your decimal place in the right place is pretty critical here. So if you have any questions at all, be sure that you consult your local county extension office for some help with this. So if we look here at the middle column of nitrate, we're less than 1,500 parts per million, we're going to consider that pretty safe. As we increase on up to 5,000, we're pretty happy about feeding that to anything that's not pregnant. Could have some issues with abortion or breeding performance in bred cows, so we're going to try to dilute this feed to 50% of the total ration. If we go between 5 and 10,000 parts per million, we're going to limit feed for non-pregnant livestock, and we wouldn't want to feed this to pregnant cows whatsoever. And if we get above 10,000 parts per million, we're not going to want to feed that at all. We're going to experience those acute symptoms and death. So again, in a drought situation, like we've sometimes experienced, if the main forage component of what you have available is going to be an annual forage that has a lot of nitrate in it, again, I'd encourage you to contact your local extension office or me, and we can talk about how can we fine-tune this idea to be really precise in the amount of mixing that we need to do to make sure that we can get the best use possible out of this hot hay, at the same time not influencing animal health. A quick note here just on minerals, because that's an entire 3 webinars in themselves. Don't forget that mineral intake not only comes from the forage that the animal consumes, but also from the water that they drink. So getting a water test is going to be something that's important. Certainly in drought conditions, water quality often declines, so that's something to also keep in mind. But once you have an idea of how much mineral you have in the forage and how much you have in the water, you can compare the intake to the requirements and then obtain some sort of salt mineral mix to create mineral balance. In general, those are often provided in a self-fed form, whether that's part of a mineral pack in a lick tub, loose mineral, mineral block. You can certainly also add mineral packs to feed that you would hand feed, for example, in a cake and the like. So you have a lot of options certainly available to you. Oops. So now we'll switch gears here again and talk a little bit about marketing the calf crop. Okay, and so an ideal feeder calf, when you talk to the feedlots, who are our customers, they're going to say things like they'd prefer if they were weaned, okay, so not off the cow, would prefer that they have spring and fall vaccinations. They'd like to know a little bit about them, want them to be green enough that they're not too fleshy. They like uniformity, and it's sometimes a benefit if they know how to eat out of a bunk. So when we think about backgrounding and preconditioning programs, and by backgrounding I'm talking about weaning the calves, say for 45 days-ish. Preconditioning can mean a lot of things. In some regions of the country, preconditioning means what I just said backgrounding means. Preconditioning to me often means those pre-weaning vaccinations. Okay, so anyway, feedlots stress benefits of minimized shipping stress, more predictable feeding results, reduced sickness and death loss in the feedlot, and reduced risk for the feeder, because that's what they're all about, is risk management and risk mitigation. Because they have reduced risk, they're probably going to be willing to spend a little more on those calves, and they'll have a higher value to them and to you. So in general, when we think about weaning nutrition, it's important to have highly palatable feeds that don't have dust. Okay, it's a good idea, especially if you got calves that are a little bit western, who've been out in the country and might not be familiar with a pen. If they have an opportunity to be introduced to some kind of a watering system, especially in some parts of Montana when you only have live water. Now some parts of Montana aren't like that. And placement of feed and water. So if those calves come in and they're pretty, nervous and they're walking around the pen, if you have the ability to place feed and water out into the pen, kind of perpendicular to the fence so that they run into it on their little jaunts, that might help them adapt more quickly. We do know that stress increases nutrient requirements, so it's important that we provide adequate energy and protein to those animals to combat that, as well as vitamins and minerals, because all four are a critical component of nutrient requirements and the nutrient requirement increase that comes along with stress. In particular, trace minerals are really important for immunity. Okay, they're also really important for reproduction as well. But since we're talking here about kind of this fall system, copper, manganese, selenium, and zinc are the four that we're going to probably focus on the most in a weaning nutrition system. All right, so now we'll talk a little bit about vaccination programs. Before I jump into that, kind of want to go back to this idea about, feeders want weaned calves, and they surely do. But a lot of operations in Montana aren't necessarily set up to be able to keep those calves for 45 days. So certainly a large majority of calves in Montana are weaned on the truck, sold right off the cow. So I think it becomes even more important, if we're going to focus on that we take good care of their nutrition before weaning. So having those mineral packages available to those cows and calves before weaning, and that we really focus here on this vaccination program. So those calves, even though they're going to be undergoing more stress because they aren't weaned, on their way to the feedlot. When they get there, they're going to be healthy because they have the mineral storage available to fight any sort of sickness they might have, and they've been well vaccinated so that they have that protection. So in general, when we think about vaccination, it's important to have, 1, a vaccine that's effective, 2, a functioning immune system, so the calf has to have the ability to respond. Their immune system has to respond to the vaccine. And finally, it's important for us to give the vaccine before the animal actually comes in contact or is exposed to the disease. So vaccines fail, and so we'll kind of go over a few reasons why that might be. So it could be that we didn't get the vaccine in the animal in time and they were already incubating the disease when they were vaccinated. It could be that the vaccine was mishandled. Okay, my goal in life is for the temperature of the vaccine to be at least as important as the temperature of the beverages that you have at a branding or other cattle working. It's really more important, but if we have it at least as important, I will consider that a success. The immune system of the animal might not be responsive for some reason. It could be that we tried to vaccinate a calf too early after passive immunity and their own immune system isn't fully functional yet. It could be that we're vaccinating them at a young age where antibodies that were from colostrum are still in their blood and they inactivate the vaccine because they think that it is a bug they need to fight. Or if an animal has experienced an inadequate nutrition program, the immune system can be negatively impacted, thus they might not be able to respond well to a vaccine. So there's more. If the animal was exposed to an overwhelming dose of the infectious agent, they just weren't able to fight it off. The duration of immunity after vaccination was inadequate, and that could be related to the idea that perhaps a booster was required and was not administered. And it could be that what's in the vaccine in regard to the antigen is different than what the animal sees in the field. So this is particularly seen maybe more in things like pink eye. So sometimes you can have big pink eye breakouts, and the bug that is causing, the bacteria that's causing the pink eye breakout doesn't look, has some antigenic differences compared to the particular type that was in the vaccine that you may or may not have used. So at times like that, when you have those big breakouts, you can have work with a veterinarian to get what's called an autogenous vaccine, which is a custom vaccine for that particular field strain. So when we think about calf vaccination programs, again, I'm going to stress that you should consult your veterinarian. Again, they're going to be more in tune with what's going on in your local area. Is there something special they need to be considering because of where you're located and the like? So most preconditioning programs like a VAC 45 or a Precon 45 or Precon 1 and 2, right? Okay, so even if they're not a VAC 45, so you're going to vaccinate them but not wean them for 45 days, they're going to recommend something like a 7 or 8 way blackleg or Clostridial at branding, and then a 7 or 8 way booster for that, plus a 5-way respiratory vaccine at pre-weaning. Some preconditioning programs want you to give the 5-way respiratory at both times, but certainly if you want to market your calves under any of those programs, definitely take a look at what those requirements are. Okay, now we're going to move into wintertime. When we think about winter feeding, we'll talk about cold weather feeding here for a few minutes. So animals and people have what we call their thermoneutral zone, okay, the TNZ. And the TNZ is a range of temperatures where animals don't have to use any extra energy to maintain their body temperature. So you can see here in our little graph, we have the thermoneutral zone is bounded by these two vertical lines. Okay, so on the left we have the lower critical temperature. On the right we have the upper critical temperature. Okay, and so this is looking at energy requirements compared to ambient temperature. Okay, so as temperature increases, you can see that feed intake, the green line, goes down. As temperature decreases, feed intake goes up, but heat production increases on both sides of lower and upper critical temperature because their energy requirements are going to increase to maintain body temperature, whether it be cooling down or heating up. So what happens in cold weather feeding when the temperature reaches the lower bound of the thermoneutral zone? Well, in the short term, animals can modify their behavior, like they could seek some shelter from the wind. So, okay, get behind a windbreak or behind a tree. Okay. In the long term, the main component for a beef cow to combat cold stress is to grow their winter hair coat. And so if they're able to modify in such a way that there's no effect on their nutrient requirements. However, if we get below the lower critical temperature, animals experience cold stress at that point. And so they have to increase their metabolic rate and heat production to supply more body heat. And this increases the dietary energy requirement. Okay, so this is important to stress here. When cattle are experiencing cold stress, protein requirements don't change. Just energy goes up. So you might be thinking, well, Rachel, what is the lower critical temperature? Well, like any good answer in animal science, it depends. And in this case, it depends on hair coat. Okay, so if you have a slick summer hair coat or a wet hair coat of any kind, any length, so let's say have a real hard driving rain and those cattle are wet to the hair, or wet to the skin, excuse me, then actually the lower critical temperature is pretty warm. It's about 59 degrees. If it's dry and you have a heavy winter coat in the dead of winter, the lower critical temperature is 18 degrees. So as you might expect, wind chill does impact the lower critical temperature. Okay, so if we have a heavy winter hair coat, then we're at 30 degrees. We don't have any increased requirements. She's able to maintain her body temperature with no extra oomph. If we add a 20-mile-an-hour wind to that 30 degrees, then the effective temperature is now 17 degrees, right at the lower critical temperature. On the other hand, if it's 10 degrees with a 20-mile-an-hour wind, then the effective temperature is now 9 below. She's going to have to expend energy to maintain body temperature. So obviously, providing shelter from the wind can help cows lessen cold stress, so having a way for them to get out of the wind is pretty important during those winter feeding periods. So here's, excuse me, a cold weather feeding rule of thumb. Cow energy requirements increase about 1% for each degree below the lower critical temperature for your situation. So say you're 20 degrees below the lower critical temperature, so that'd be like 3 below if you had a heavy winter hair coat, then that would mean that energy requirements would increase 20%. So this might, if in this particular example, that might mean about 4.5 to 5 pounds of a good quality hay that you need to feed extra that day, or 3 to 3.5 pounds of grain. We'll talk a bit here about heifer development. When we think about heifer reproduction, the most limiting factor is puberty. And so basically what we're trying to get to happen is this estrus cycle diagram here is going to show us all those different hormones interacting in such a way that the estrus cycle works. The cow's in standing heat. She ovulates and a functional egg, and off we go, and she's ready to be bred. So puberty is often defined as the first ovulation and show of estrus. And so what's happening is the hormone sensitivity of different receptors in the brain and ovaries is changing over time as the animal matures. Once everything's good to go, then that's when we reach that system that's illustrated in this diagram. We know that age at puberty is important. So if our goal is to calve cows at 2-year-olds, as 2-year-olds between 23 and 25 months of age, then they need to conceive at 14 to 16 months of age. We know that breed can affect age at puberty, and that breeds that are traditionally been selected for increased milk production are younger at puberty in general, while breeds that were selected for greater growth and mature size are often older at puberty. I think these differences, as we've improved beef cattle genetics and production, are less stark differences than they used to be. And we'll return back to heterosis because it affects age at puberty too. So the percent of heifers reaching puberty at a given age is going to be greater for crossbreds than for straightbreds, although this effect decreases with increasing age. So here's the research where that came from. So we've got days of age along the bottom x-axis of the graph, and then the increased percent of heifers who are crossbred. So at 390 days of age, for example, 20% more crossbred heifers were cycling than straightbred heifers. As you can see, though, the effect decreases with age. And as promised, we revisit this idea of sire scrotal circumference. So selection for larger scrotal circumference in herd sires is an indirect method of selecting for younger age at puberty in heifers. Okay, and so if we look here at this graph, shows us the Angus scrotal circumference genetic trend by birth year. And so you can see as we kind of bop along here, can you see that in the late 80s and early 90s is when we made the discovery that scrotal circumference and heifer age at puberty were related to one another? Now we have this crazy exponential increase in genetic trend for scrotal circumference. So certainly, I think because of this and a variety of other management strategies that have improved over time, the U.S. cow herd is much more fertile than it used to be. So like when we were talking about calving distribution and how that can impact the bottom line, it can also impact the cow's longevity for the rest of her life. So this is data from the early 70s. The heifers that calve early in their first calving season tend to continue to do so, and thus wean heavier calves throughout their lifetime, because as they're calving earlier, those calves are older at weaning. We also talked about how we might breed young cows, yearling heifers, early in the breeding season, and some of that data comes again from the early 70s, where Wiltbank found that first calf heifer postpartum interval, so the time between calving and when they got bred back, was between 15 and 25 days longer than the older cows. And so this is the data from which that recommendation that heifers be bred ahead of the mature cow herd came from. And this is what that looked like. Postpartum interval in days. As you can see, as cow age increases, postpartum interval decreases. We know that puberty is correlated with weight. So puberty is going to occur for each individual animal at some genetically predetermined size. But we can't look at her or take a measure of her and say, it's 652 pounds. Okay? So traditionally, the thought here was that high pregnancy rates can be obtained only when heifers reach that target weight. Okay? And I think that's still true. But overfeeding is not a good strategy here. Okay? Because it's costly. Fat heifers have weaker estrus symptoms and reduced conception rates compared to heifers in moderate condition. We also have higher embryonic mortality in fat heifers as well. And while they're being fat, they're depositing a lot of fat in that udder, as we can have decreased mammary development as well. So in summary then, there is no one-size-fits-all to heifer development. Each operation is different. So I'd really encourage you to evaluate that pretty critically and choose the development program that fits your resources and environment as well as your goals. Because what happens down the road at your neighbors might not fit your environment whatsoever. All right, as we finish up in this section, we'll talk now about some overarching thoughts from Rachel about cow-calf management decisions. All right, so as we just talked about, there's no single approach for all operations in regard to management of any kind. And the variables that are important for management are going to depend on your particular enterprise. So things like, how much forage do you produce? What kind of alternatives do you have for marketing? Energy costs, what's your debt structure? What kind of biological type of cattle do you have? What's your environment look like? How much does it cost to get feed both from a nutrient standpoint and from a labor and delivery of the feed standpoint? And then just how competent are you as a manager? So how would one then evaluate a management program? Well, eventually my goal would be to use the profitability formula, where you have profit or loss being equal to the production you've produced times the price you get for it minus your costs. And so we generally reflect production in numbers and pounds, And so we can have high sustained profitability, so profitability that continues to be at a good high level over time, if we figure out what is the optimum combination of production, price, and costs for our operation. In the short term, though, we need to balance profitability with our need to conserve or improve resources as we move forward. So maximize or optimize. There's a whole bunch of references in the beef cattle industry to maximizing performance. So we've really selected for high milk production and weaning weight. Can use heterosis to maximize performance. We talk about maximizing reproductive breed back, and we want to maximize profit. But if we reflect on these, oftentimes these are going to be referring or inferring that we need to increase production no matter the cost. Okay, so we can have 97% breed up on those cows, but how much did we have to feed them to get that? So it's important to kind of keep in the back of your mind that maximum profitability is generally going to happen before maximum production. So maybe trying to optimize something to get that optimal combination might be a good goal to have. So we can adjust that profitability formula to a break-even price. That can help us make some decisions. So break-even, as you guys probably know, be the price that your calves have to bring to cover the costs of producing them. So this is a formula I like to use when I'm teaching this concept, that the break-even price is the annual cow cost divided by the average weaning weight of the calves times the percent calf crop. Okay, so let's say we have an example cow herd that has $550 per cow costs. They've been weaning 575-pound calves, and they have 86% calf crop. Okay, so in this example with this formula, our break-even price is $111 a hundred, or $1.11 per pound. So when we think about that bottom half of the equation for break-even, is we take the weaning weight and we multiply that by the percent calf crop weaned. This yields pounds of calf weaned per cow exposed. Okay, so this table kind of shows how those two things influence each other. So we've got percent calf crop in the first column from 75% on up to 100, and average weaning weight of all calves in 50-pound increments from 400 to 600, just for an example. Okay, so remember that calf crop has to do with the number of calves that are born and weaned compared to the number of cows you turned out with bulls the previous year. So how can we manage percent calf crop? Okay, so if we want to calculate it, we're going to say how many calves did we wean, and we're going to divide that by how many cows we bred the previous year. Okay, multiply that by 100 gives us percent net calf crop. So let's say our example producer that we've been looking at wants to raise his calf crop percentage from 86, I think I said, to 90. How much can the cow cost increase? Okay, so we can take our break-even formula. We know that 575 is still going to be the weaning weight. We're going to change the calf crop to 0.9, and we're going to leave our break-even price at $1.11. Okay, so if we want this to happen, we can spend an additional $25.56, so cow cost can increase from $5.50 to $5.75.56 in order to get that 90% calf crop and still have the same break-even price. So what kind of things, management things, affect net calf crop? So this is some data from Fort Keogh that did a 14-year summary of their calf losses. And so we have percent reduction in net calf crop. Okay, the largest percentage comes from cows that were open at the end of breeding. Also have some loss from calf death right around calving, that perinatal period, death from birth to weaning, calf deaths during gestation, so you called her pregnant at the end of breeding, but she didn't have a calf in the spring. And so that gives us, in this particular example, their net calf crop weaned over this 14-year period was 71. So what kind of factors affect net calf crop then? Well, Dr. Bellows, retired scientist from Fort Keogh, said in 2002 that reproductive failure in the U.S. cow herd was equal to an average loss of $15 a cow. Okay, well, if we think about what costs have done since then, I think it's probably a good guess that it costs more than $15 per cow here today. Reproductive losses are 6 times higher, have 6 times more impact than those for respiratory problems. And the top 3 reproductive losses that we face are going to be female infertility, calving difficulty, and abortions and stillbirths. So if we look at some of the other components of the break-even formula, weaning weight is obviously one of those. So if we manage weaning weight in such a way that we could increase it, we can lower our break-even price in order to cover our production costs. So here's an example of how that could look. So I've made an assumption down here that I have an 85% calf crop and a $500 annual cow cost. So if we look here at weaning weight, increasing in 50-pound increments from 400 to 650, and we do our pounds of calf weaned per cow exposed equation, and we look at how the break-even price changes with increasing weaning weight, we can see we make a few bigger impacts in break-even price as we start to increase, but over time we can still make those improvements as we have heavier calves if we don't have to pay more to get them that heavy. So here's an example about weaning weight. Okay, so we have our producer, and he says, I think if I used an implant, I could increase pounds of calf weaned exposed by 10 pounds, and it would only cost me $2. Okay, what's the new break even? So we had $550 cow cost before, now we have $552. Okay, we know that the bottom half of the break even equation is pounds of calf weaned per cow exposed, so we're adding 10 to that, and so our break even actually decreases now to $1.09. So if we were trying to evaluate a decision of should I implant or not, in this particular example, yes you should, because break even is less. So as we've talked about already, a major factor affecting weaning weight is calf age, right? So if we can tighten up those calving distributions, get those calves on the ground sooner, they're going to be heavier at weaning. Calving season can influence weaning weight, particularly how long it is. Implants can make an impact, feed and nutrition, selection for growth in your cow herd itself, and heterosis all can be factors that affect weaning weight. And finally, health. If an animal is unhealthy, they're not going to gain as rapidly as one who is healthy. So here's an example about cow costs and how if we were able to decrease cow costs in $50 increments here from $650 down to $400 with that same assumption we had before of 85% calf crop and 500-pound weaning weights. You can see that for every $50 decrease in cow cost in this example, you decrease your break-even price by 12 cents a pound. So here's a cow cost example using the break-even equation. An example producer says, well, feed costs, we could lower those by $50 a year per cow, but I think it would also impact our calf crop and it would be 5% less. Okay, so we take $500, we had 550 cow costs before, now we're going to save $50 on feed. We hope we can still wean 575-pound calves, and we're going to lower the calf crop from 86 to 81%. Now this seems kind of counterintuitive, right? You wouldn't think, well, I'm going to have fewer calves, but the break-even price actually decreases to $1.07. So it's important to think about those management styles, how your decisions might influence break-even, and put some pencil to some paper and help you make some of those decisions. So as you might expect, assessments of cost of production are hard. You have to sit down and think and keep good records. So these are often the most neglected piece of cow-calf management. So it's important to maintain your expense records in such a way that you can really do a good job of analyzing the areas of costs that you have on your operation. So knowing where the major costs occur and how you might be able to lower or maintain them with keeping the level of productivity of the cattle in an acceptable region for you. And so there's quite a bit of study that's happened on this, and in one relatively recent, they found that the average return, or the average difference between high return and low return producers was $114 per head in cow costs. Okay, so imagine that. We have a similar production system, similar weaning weight, similar calf crop, but one spends $114 per cow more per year than the other. So in some survey work and some work in actual IRM SPA data, they found that the top 5 ways that low-cost producers reduce their costs were by reducing harvested and supplemental feed costs, using rotational grazing in such a way that they have better pasture management, using the right genetics, so fitting your cow type to your environment, having lower labor costs, and implementing a strong herd health program. So other or miscellaneous costs are important too, in addition to those major cost areas we've been talking about. So things like fuel or machinery or repairs, supplies, utilities, taxes. So these account often for less than about 20% of most people's average budgets, but yet make over 40% of the difference in the cow cost between the high and low cost producers. So this is saying that 40% of that $114 a cow cost came from these miscellaneous places. So